until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. That phrase, brothers and sisters, completes or concludes the epistle reading which we read earlier today, which speaks about God's grace, God's gift to us, and interestingly, and contrary to some understanding or some denominations' understanding of God's grace, Apostle Paul tells us that grace is given to each of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Yes, the gift of salvation is offered to all without exception. But then there has to be a response. You have to receive the gift. You see, it's one thing to be offered a gift and you reject it, or not accept it, or not notice that the gift is being offered, with accepting and being thankful and developing the gift. There's a big difference. So yes, the gift of salvation specifically is offered to all without exception, but it's a two-way street. The result being that not everyone acquires salvation. It's offered to all, but not all acquire it. Apostle Paul continues. When he ascended up high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean? But that he had also descended first into the lower parts of the earth. He who descended is he who also ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fulfill all things. And his gifts were that some should be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. So we've spoken about the gift of salvation. That's in a class of its own. And then we speak of many gifts which are part of the greater gift. And Apostle Paul does do the division. And he speaks of the fact that many of us, all of us actually, have different gifts. Some of us are like the apostles and can, like the apostle means missionary, given a mission and can fulfill a mission. Some of us can work well that way in fulfilling a mission and getting the job done. Others have the gift of the prophets, and prophecy is normally understood as foretelling the future, but the ancient Greek word does not narrow it down to just that. Prophimi means I warn. I speak before the bad thing happens. I warn. Okay? So the prophets, if you look at the quantity of things that they said, both in the Old Testament and in subsequent Christian prophecy, more of it is warning than it is about foretelling the future. Some of it's about foretelling the future, but most of it is about warning. There is consequence to this action. And so that explains why the prophets were not only not embraced and accepted by the people they were talking to, but they were rejected in the main. Some of them were executed and killed because what they were saying was not convenient for the powers that be. So some of us have the gift of foresight in knowing what can happen or what can be a consequence to certain actions, and we speak it. Others have the gift of evangelism, evangelists, being able to give the good news, preach the good news, and are good at explaining. That's evangelism. Others are given the gift of being pastors and teachers, shepherds, in other words, and teachers. And that is another way of caring for the souls of the faithful. May not be good at explaining, but may be good at caring for and showing with action more than what any words can express. That's the shepherd, pastors. Now, the word for the faithful, we do get ipisti, the faithful, in the Bible, but we very often get this to describe the believers, and that is saints, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, προς τον καταρτισμόν των Αγίων εις έργον διακονίας. We often have the definition of saint as someone who's at the end of the journey, as someone who has attained a level of holiness at the end of the journey. And that is indeed the most common definition of saint. But in this context, we must understand saint as being the word used for all the Christians at the beginning of the journey. Why? Because Apostle Paul uses it in this way. He doesn't use it as those who have been perfected. He uses it as those who are part of the process, who are beginning their journey. That our job as leaders, shepherds, teachers, evangelists, prophets, apostles, is to equip the saints for the work of ministry, that they too can be part of the ministry in their way. If not in leadership, which are the gifts that were just listed, then in the support of the work of the ministry. And the ministry in Greek is diakonia, service. Service. Service can mean both what we do in terms of our worship, but it can also mean serving the people, both spiritually and even physically. And that explains why most churches have a feeding of the homeless program or other such similar drives throughout the year. So the whole purpose of our journey in this life, dear friends and brothers and sisters, is for the building up of the body of Christ until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. The Greek is «Μέχρι καταντήσομεν οι πάντες εις την ενότητα της πίστεως και της επιγνώσεως του Υιού του Θεού, εις άνδρα τέλειον, εις μέτρον ηλικίας του πληρώματος του Χριστού». This is very interesting, because instantly what this phrase tells us is that there is growth involved. That we're not just Christian at a moment, in a moment, and that's all, and that's it. That we are not just Christian. Before I criticize other Christian denominations, I'll criticize ourselves first. We're not just Christian when we happen to sign some certificate at the beginning of our life, or that someone signs it on our behalf, which is all very important, and there is a reason for that. Our problem is that we leave it there. We leave it at that. And we don't grow subsequently. We don't grow into maturity. We don't grow to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. We don't complete the journey. And that's a criticism for not just the Orthodox Christians, but for most mainstream Christians who lose the learning bit. We've got the sign up bit, but we don't have the learning bit subsequently. And today's sermon and any other similar passage from the New Testament should challenge us and should inspire us to get into a process of growth and learning, to study, to ask questions, to learn. Which brings me to one of the saints that we commemorate today as a good example of what we're talking about. Today, the 10th of January, we celebrate the memory of Saint Gregory of Nyssa. Saint Gregory of Nyssa lived in the 300s and was a younger brother of Saint Vasilios the Great. Saint Vasilios was a good decade older than Saint Gregory, and they were two sons of a big family. There were about 7 or 8 children in that family. And one of their sisters also is recognized as a saint in our church, Macrina. Now, Saint Gregory, being a younger brother, looked up to Saint Vasilios, his older brother, and learned from his journey. Saint Vasilios and his whole family were from Cappadocia, for those of you who have visited Cappadocia in Asia Minor. Today the Turks have made a great tourist destination of Cappadocia and profiting from our history and our heritage. He travelled from Cappadocia to Athens, where he studied both secular science, secular education, as well as continuing his theological education in his own private time. Saint Gregory followed the example 10 years later, also studied all the sciences of the time, and was what we would call today a very educated person, just like St. Basil. St. Basil was a good friend of St. Gregory the theologian, and these three, St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory the theologian, and St. Gregory of Nyssa, are who are known in our history as the Cappadocian Fathers. The Cappadocian Fathers. And they are to us what Augustine, I hope I've pronounced it correctly, was to Western Christian culture. So Augustine, for those of you who have read history, is a pioneering father in terms of the mentality of Western European Christianity. A lot of the things they think and the way they think and the mentality they have is based on Augustine, also 300s. Now, Augustine was the influencing father for the rest of Western Christianity. For us, that wasn't the case. For us, we have the Cappadocian Fathers, those three that I've mentioned, and the subsequent celebration of the three hierarchs on the 30th of January replaces St. Gregory of Nyssa and places St. John Chrysostom in that grouping. That's for another reason. That's a story from 700 years later. Let's focus on the Cappadocian Fathers. Why are they so important? And why is St. Gregory of Nyssa so important for what we've mentioned today? The first thing that St. Gregory of Nyssa does is explain to us what it means to acquire this measure of stature, to grow up and not be, let's say, immature. If we're talking about maturity is what we want to achieve, well, there's a maturity of faith, and then there's an immaturity of faith. And there are many examples in the Bible which describe an immaturity of faith. All of us, myself included, begin immature in the faith, understanding some things, not all things, but desiring to constantly grow and constantly learn more. The mistake that all of us may have done in the past is to think that we've understood it all. We've understood the Bible, we've understood the message, it's good enough, I know enough, I've packaged it, I've boxed it up. Anything that doesn't match my understanding of the faith and the Bible, well, that mustn't be Christian, or that mustn't stack up, or that mustn't stand as valid. A very good example is the fact that many Christians in an immature stage of their journey read the Bible literally. We've seen this time and time again. I've been there when I was younger. We read the Bible literally, black and white. That's what it says, but that's what it says. How can you read it differently? How can you interpret it differently? St. Gregory of Nyssa teaches us how. Not only he, but many of the Church Fathers. But St. Gregory of Nyssa is a standout. St. Gregory of Nyssa tells us that yes, there are parts of the Bible that you can only read literally. Sure, absolutely. Books of history, for example, describe the historical journey of the Jews. There's no other way you can read that. You have to read it literally. But there are other parts of the Bible that need to be read symbolically or allegorically. A reading of between of the lines. And there are in-betweens as well, where some passages need to be read both literally and allegorically. There's a literal element, but you don't go far unless you read that passage allegorically. So here is a quote from St. Gregory of Nyssa in his introduction to his homilies or sermons on the book of the Bible known as the Song of Songs, where he says you need to move on from literalism. Listen to this. It is entirely possible to collect thousands of citations from the rest of the prophets to show the necessity of an insight into the sense of the words. If such an interpretation is rejected, as some prefer, i.e. rejecting an allegorical interpretation, the result seems similar to me to what would happen if someone were to serve for food unprocessed grain as food at a meal for people, not grinding the wheat, not winnowing the chaff from the grain, not thrashing the wheat on the threshing floor, not preparing bread in the usual manner for use as food. And just as unprocessed grain is food for animals, so someone might say that The divinely inspired words, unprocessed by winnowing insight, are perfect food for the irrational rather than for the rational people. This is true not only of the Old Testament, but of much of the gospel teaching. That's very interesting, that this is said in the 300s AD, and here we are in 2021, still not getting it. And I can't blame people, because I was there once upon a time as well, because all of us will pick up the Bible and just read it in a black and white fashion. And not all of us have been exposed to patristic teaching, which tells us, hold on a second, there's another way of reading the Bible, a better way, which the Bible itself allows for. And if you only read it literally, it's like you are irrational. Whereas if you are opening up to the allegorical, you are being much more thinking about it. You are dwelling upon it much more and learning more from it. So, in this light, St. Gregory gives us a number of works, a number of little books or essays, let's say, that are of that approach to understanding the Bible. One I'd like to refer to is the life of Moses. Now, you might say, if you were stuck on the literal interpretation, well, the life of Moses is in the book of Genesis. Why does someone else need to write a life of Moses? Why isn't the book of Genesis enough? It's there, it's in black and white. Well, yes, you would say that if you were a literalist. And you will learn 5 things from that, and that's good. But if you were to follow St. Gregory of Nyssa's example, you might find that the life of Moses, if it were to be read between the lines, and he goes line by line from Genesis, but he inserts in the story you and I, you and me. He puts us in the story. That the life of Moses is, in a way, a symbol or a pattern of what each and every one of us have to go through in our spiritual faith journey. So to summarize, and you can pick up the book on the internet, freely available, The Life of Moses by St. Gregory of Nyssa. He describes 3 stages in our journey of faith. Like Moses, the first stage is pretty much darkness. The second stage is illumination. And the third stage is divine mist. It works better in the Greek. So the darkness is skotos, skotadi. You're in darkness, you haven't learned anything yet. But you come to a knowledge, you come to learning, you come to awareness through reading or experience or meeting other people who are already in that realm, that spiritual realm. And that second stage is photisis, illumination. You are enlightened, your eyes open, you start understanding. But you can get stuck in that second stage and not go further. You read, you understand, you think you've got it. But like Moses, who couldn't see God, he was brought into that experience of illumination. I'm referring to the burning bush experience. And he felt like, well, that's as close as I can possibly get. He delivers the 10 Commandments to the Jews. He comes back up Mount Sinai and he's lost in this mist. And the Greek is very important. Theos gnophos. Gnophos. Theikos gnophos. Divine mist. It's similar to the darkness, but it's not darkness. For any one of us who has walked, and I've said this before a few years ago, for any of us who have walked through fog, it's not dark necessarily, it could be daytime. You know that there's light there, but the mist is this close. You know that there's something beyond, but you can't see it, but you know it's there. That's what's being conveyed here by this divine mist. What stage of life is that? Well, that's a stage of life when you realize that not only can you not see God with your physical eyes, but even your mind, although was helpful in the illumination stage, is not ultimately enough to fully experience God. That experience just comes by experience and feeling it. The mind cannot package it or box it up. And this is straight down the line orthodox theology we call apophatic theology. In other words, start with any definition in the dictionary and then negate it, and you'll be closer to God. Is God containable? No. Is God understandable? To an extent, yes, but ultimately no. You've got to negate any definition in the dictionary, and that's closer to understanding God. Apophatic theology. We use so much of it in the liturgy. So that's the life of Moses. Finishing up and tying it back to the epistle reading. All right. So we have considered that you don't just become a Christian in a moment of life and then that's it. That there is clearly a process of growth involved. And the question is, at what point do we reach that fullness? This is the other contribution of St. Gregory of Nyssa in a wonderful book known as Perikataskevής Anthropou, on the making of humanity. How did that book come about? We've spoken about St. Basil, his older brother. His older brother wrote a book known as the Exaimeron, the 6 days of creation. And what St. Basil does is he goes day by day from Genesis and he says, all right, day 1, day 2, day 3, and he expounds and explains how creation matters for us as Christians and as believers. Only one problem. He only got to explaining up to the 5th day. So he started off intending to do the 6 days, but he didn't actually get to the 6th day. He actually died early. He died only at 50 years old, St. Basil. Now, what happened on the 6th day in Genesis? The creation of humankind. So St. Gregory felt that, we've got to finish the book. St. Basil has done the creation of the world. He's spoken about animals and plants and the cosmos. He's done all that. He left me the most difficult one, humanity. And St. Gregory provides us with this beautiful book where he speaks about Adam and Eve and the book of Genesis and the creation of humanity, with the basic message being that we are still being created. That we are still in the process of reaching the completion. That we are still in the process of being completed. That humanity might physically be complete, but spiritually still incomplete. And that it is incumbent on each and every one of us to acquire and grow to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. And that maturity and fullness and completion and perfection is achieved through this life, but ultimately at the end of this life. How opposite that is to literalism in the story of Genesis and Adam and Eve. And this upsets many people who have committed themselves to a literal interpretation of the Bible, whether they're Orthodox, Protestant, or Catholic. But Adam and Eve were created, that's it, done and dusted. No. St. Gregory of Nyssa clearly opens our eyes to another reading, a much better and more spiritual reading of the book of Genesis. That challenges us, that invites us, that inspires us to pick up these books and read them. If the language is too sophisticated, there are editions of these books where modern scholars have explained where the church fathers are coming from. What are the key concepts you've got to understand before you can read this essay or the book? For example, Περί κατασκευής ανθρώπου. I hope, brothers and sisters, that today's sermon will challenge you to grow, will challenge you to set higher ideals and set your sights on greater achievement, and under no circumstances to think that we've got it down pat. We have much to learn, you and I and all of us. Amen.